Hello and welcome to a special Inside Story, today coming to you from the Doha Forum here in Qatar. In the next hour we'll be discussing two key issues. One, fake news, and two, continuing attacks, literally and metaphorically, against journalists around the world. If you've got fake news combined with a world that lacks functioning journalism, how can you have functioning democracy? How can you trust your journalists and your politicians? Setting up our discussion today, here's Sarah Kariat.
The faces of those who've died in search of the truth, some of the 52 journalists killed this year alone. Journalists are increasingly in danger for just doing their job. And they say they need protecting now, more than ever. Americans were reminded of that need when a gunman killed 4 reporters at a local newspaper in Maryland in June.
I think you should let me run the country, you run CNN.
And then there's the influence of Donald Trump and his claims of fake news. But there are other risks from asking questions that people in power don't want to answer. The murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi shocked the world, highlighting how journalists are vulnerable to killing, kidnap, attacks and imprisonment, even if under the supposed protection of their own diplomats. In Myanmar, the silencing of 2 Reuters reporters continues 12 months into 7-year prison sentences for Wa Lon and Chow So-u. They were convicted of obtaining secret state documents while investigating reports of the massacre of Rohingya villagers. The Reuters journalist Jamal Khashoggi, the Maryland newspaper staff, and Philippines war reporter Maria Ressa have all been awarded Person of the Year by Time magazine. It says it's honouring what it calls guardians of the truth. Deprived of freedom are at least 32 journalists in Egypt, including Mahmoud Hussein, the Al Jazeera reporter jailed without charge for almost 2 years. Al Jazeera denies government accusations of broadcasting false news and demands his immediate release. Sarah Khairat, Inside Story.
Okay, there we are. Here we go. Let's bring in our guests today here on Inside Story, coming to you from the Doha Forum. They are Maria Ressa, just in the past week or so, named as one of the Time Persons of the Year. David Schlesinger, he is from the Committee to Protect Journalists, and Sean Spicer, formerly the White House Press Secretary. Maria, can I come to you first? What is fake news?
We felt this turn in the Philippines in July of 2016. Right now, well, let's talk about it first in terms of the global landscape, right? For it is whatever power doesn't like. That's when President Trump called CNN and the New York Times fake news. A week later, President Duterte in the Philippines called Rappler fake news. From my experience, fake news is something that has been embedded on social media when social media was weaponized. And it happened not during the campaign of President Duterte, but after he took office. It was in July of 2016, the same month that the drug war began, that social media was weaponized and exponential lies, what the old definition of what fake news would be, lies, were embedded, repeated exponentially. When you repeat a lie 1,000,000 times, it's the truth.
Sean Spicer, what's your definition of fake news?
Well, I think that there's sort of a continuum or a spectrum. There's stuff that we have seen, sort of what we in America call tabloid journalism, stuff that you find at the checkout counter that talks about aliens coming down, that I think is demonstrably things that everybody agrees upon didn't happen or false or just outlandish. I think what we've seen now is that continuum move into a lot of stories where there might be a piece which there is an element that is wrong or off, so that if you assume that a story has to be 100% right, you'll find 2 or 3 or 5 things in a story and say, well, then therefore it's false, it's fake. And then that extends all the way to what I think Maria was alluding to a little bit, which is now it has somewhat gone even further, which is that people who disagree with the story, the narrative of it, say, well, that's fake. And so it sort of encompasses now a lot more than where it did maybe, say, 5 or 10 years ago.
But that's two different things, surely. Just to pause you there for a second. Using fake news as an accusation or using it as a description,
Right, but you asked
those
what
are two different things.
Yeah, you asked a question of what it was, and I'm trying to explain how there's been an evolution in what it's come to mean from where it was, say, 5 years ago.
Understood. David, why does fake news translate into attacks on journalists and reporters?
Well, being a journalist has always been a dangerous profession. Journalists have always been killed in pursuit of the truth. Journalists run towards danger instead of away danger. We may not like that, we can accept that. What is particularly worrying now is that journalists are being targeted for their stories as a way of silencing them. So when people first say, this is fake news, then they say these reporters do not have a right to live or to be free. Right now, there are 251 journalists in prison around the world for their reporting. 52 journalists were killed last year. Of those 52, 33 were murdered. I mean, this year, 2018, I've already ended the year. 33 murdered for their journalism. That is the most horrific kind of censorship imaginable. And I think it all starts when you no longer have acceptance of the fact that there are facts in this world and that journalists actually are providing a service for society in searching out those facts and revealing them to the world.
Sean Spicer,
I think one of the things that's interesting is I don't disagree with a lot of what David said. I think there's a couple issues. Number one, the lack of human dignity of any individual, regardless of I mean, in this case, obviously, journalists being under attack is something that should concern all of us, especially those of us in a democracy where people aren't admitting it. So I don't think that that's an issue. What I think is problematic from where I sit is that the Society of Professional Journalism's Code of Ethics actually says that journalists should welcome criticism of their stories. And what I have found, at least from where I sit, is that any questioning of any story is then sort of an attack on a journalist. And I think that that's part of the problem as well, is that when you see stories, for example, the other day I landed in Hong Kong, the front page of the USA Today said in the lead article, former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly. That is demonstrably false. He is still the White House Chief of Staff. And so there is a lack of accountability that I think is existing within journalism now, and so that any attack is deemed as an attack on journalism as opposed to inviting criticism or acknowledging their own mistakes.
So I was the editor-in-chief of Reuters for many years. I had a long career with Reuters. And I would say that one of the things that marks a professional news organization is the willingness to correct quickly and transparently. All organizations make mistakes. There's no question about that. We try not to, but we make mistakes. What marks a professional is you correct those mistakes quickly and immediately. And no one in the journalist community argues with legitimate criticism of stories or legitimate pointing out of errors. I think what we do object to is being labeled an enemy of the people when we are not. What we are doing, excuse me, let me finish. What journalists are doing is exposing facts to light. Darkness is the friend of the rats who scramble around doing their dirty work under the cover. What journalists are trying to do is help society by shedding light and sending those rats scurrying back and clamping down on corruption, clamping down on malfeasance, and exposing that. That is not being an enemy of the people, that is being a true friend of the people.
Sean Spicer, just to go back to what your job used to be, when you used to go out into what used to be the underground swimming pool with Richard Nixon at the White House and walk up to that podium every day and talk to the press, did you ever think to yourself, I am going to propagate fake news, or I'm going to manipulate the media, or I'm just going to react to whatever the questions are? Because there were times during your tenure when, with all due respect to you, sir, you looked utterly dumbfounded by the questions that you were on the receiving end of.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it is the job of any PR person to go out and give their spin as to what that's just the reality of what PR professionals do. There were days when clearly I would be asked a question where I knew the journalist knew the answer or knew that I couldn't answer a question because of some legality
Yeah, but sometimes you
Hold
lie.
on, let me answer the question.
On more than one or
my
two
point
occasions,
is
the
that
White
there were,
House lied.
I'm sorry?
When you were in that job, you lied, and your colleague, who was in, just let me finish, your colleague Kellyanne Conway, she told lies as well.
Hold on, with all due respect, I've made mistakes. I've been very clear about that there are days and things that I did that I wish I could have either known more at the time, but for you to sit there and say, I've lied, I've made mistakes. There are days when I wish I could have had more information, or I could have answered a question more holistically or more accurately, but I never, ever got up and knowingly lied. And for you to sit here and make that accusation, I think is exactly part of the problem.
Okay,
Hold on, no, with all due respect, I sit here today and I will tell you, I've made mistakes. I've answered questions that I thought I could have answered better. But to the point that I just made to David, countless stories after countless stories had some mistake in them. If you're going to tell me, and David just got up here and said everyone makes mistakes, and yet a good journalist will get up there and say, hey, I've made this, I need to correct it, or I need to enhance it. I'm in here saying the exact same thing, that I've made mistakes, but for you to sit here and say that when I make a mistake, it's a lie, when a journalist makes a mistake, well, that's part of doing business, it's exactly part of the problem.
Okay, point number one, you talked about a terror attack in Atlanta. You talked about it on television.
Yes, I made a mistake.
Hold on.
Is that what you want to hear?
Hold on. You talked about a terror attack in Atlanta. You talked about it on television, on radio, and in print.
Yep.
It took you 24 hours to say, actually, and I think, to paraphrase what you said at the time, hold that thought. What you said was, oh, sorry, I was actually talking about what happened at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. Your colleague, and metaphorically, you were in the room with her, Kellyanne Conway, she made up a terror attack, the Bowling Green massacre. It was a hashtag, it was trending, it never happened. And to Donald Trump's base, can I suggest to you that all it takes is for someone like you or a Kellyanne Conway to talk about something that gets traction via Fox and Friends. Mr. Trump watches it between 5 and 6 in the morning, Washington time, and it feeds on itself.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to say this one more time. You just pointed out something that I will sit here today, and yes, I mistook the location of an event. I apologize for it. I will continue to say I made a mistake. Therefore, but if you're going to sit here and go through every critique that I've made, I have an entire list I can go through of every publication from Reuters to CNN to USA Today that have equally made mistakes. But if you're going to hold one side accountable, then hold the other side accountable. And that's part of the problem. You only want to look at one side of the ledger. If you're going to make this discussion better, and this is where I think part of the fabric has broken down, is that every journalist can get on and become a pundit on television, tweet out every thought that they have, make every mistake in the world, and there's no accountability. When I make a mistake, it's, you lied, this is the problem. I think the way that you've brought this up is exactly what the problem is. You hold one side of the ledger accountable and you ignore the other.
Can I jump in just a little? So I think the difference is that the contract between power and the journalist has been broken because of this anger, right? If we look at the way Robin Wright just talked with the Iranian foreign minister, that was holding to account. And I think part of what's happened in the United States, in the Philippines, is that power holds so much power. Journalists don't have that power. And when you attack in the same way that this has become so contentious so fast, there's no place to go, and rational discussion
I don't disagree
goes out.
with that. But again, just look at the current. We were up here trying to have a civil discussion about the state of where things are, and that's the point, is that I don't think this comes back to power. It comes back to tone, respect, and civility. And you can't look at one side of the ledger and say, this is you're to blame, because that's how this conversation started. I'm willing, and I think I've now said it 8 times, to say that myself and others can create a better environment in working with the press. I look at it as a two-way street, and I think you're absolutely right. But I think that when you look, particularly in the case of the United States, 92% of the coverage by one standard is negative against the President of the United States. Harvard's done a study, Pew's done another study. At some point, I think as an industry and a professionalism, there's a degree of accountability where you sit back and say, is that an accurate representation of the policies and coverage of this administration, which compared to all past administrations is largely out of massive whack. And so if we're going to have a discussion and you actually want it to improve the relationship, then you can't start off with one side violently attacking the other and saying, oh, you can't question me. That's the problem. Exactly the way this conversation started is exactly why we are where we are now.
I don't think any journalist would say you can't question me. I think journalists welcome questioning. I think where the breakdown occurs is when you have power, in this case, the President of the United States, whom you are representing, calling journalists the enemy of the people. This then gets picked up by strong men and women around the world, and this then becomes a license, actually a license to kill, a license to harass, a license to threaten, a license to intimidate. And that, I think, is bad for society.
Right, and if I can, I would just say that with respect to the term that you brought up, I'm not a fan of it. I believe that every industry, every profession has good and bad. And it is much more effective to call out the bad and to praise the good if you want to change behavior. When I wrote a book, I literally went out of my way to name reporters that I necessarily didn't agree with as examples of top-notch professionals. Because what I wanted to show to readers, to your point about having an effect, is to say, look, you don't have to agree with them. Reporters are fair and tough. You're not there to be your friends. They're there to uncover the truth and to pursue the facts. But if they treat you fairly and professionally, that's all you can ask for. So I actually agree with you on that. But I think that at some point there is a reflection that journalists have to have back and say, are you a journalist or are you a television pundit in a Twitter? And that's the problem, is that where is that line today? Is it I get to be a CNN, MSNBC cable host where I get to go on, and then when I write my story in the Washington Post or wherever, or Reuters, will ignore what I said about my personal beliefs and thoughts? And that's where I think that you've lost a lot of the distinction about, but the last point that I would make is, I agree with you that it is not a synonymous power, President of the United States in a reporter outlet, right? But please don't underestimate the power of a story and saying if it goes into CNN, because I've had enough stories where it started in a prominent, respected news organization and it goes viral. And I'll give you an example, the first moment that you want to talk about where this administration actually started, 5 o'clock on January 20th, after being sworn in, Donald Trump has his first pool spray. We invite all the journalists in to cover him signing these executive actions as part of his commitment to moving his agenda forward. And what's the first thing that gets reported out? Falsely, that is removed the bust of Martin Luther King out of the Oval Office. And what was the reporter's answer? Oh, well, somebody was blocking me. Now stop for a moment and think about the mentality that's going through that journalist's head. Here's the President of the United States signing all of this stuff. Here's all the people in the room. And what's the journalist thinking? Where can I get this guy?
Okay.
Not what's happening, where can I get you?
Okay, let's move it on a little bit, because in fairness to you, Sean, lest you think that everyone, it's national, have a go at Sean Spicer Day, which honestly it's not. Let's move it on to the appropriation of the term fake news, because it wasn't Donald Trump, it wasn't the Republicans, it was the Democrats. But there is an overlap, isn't there, Maria, between the strength of character of, you used the phrase, David, hard men leaders, hard men presidents or prime ministers. Maria, you're at ground zero. You're on the other end of the equation that Sean is trying to define for us. What's it like for you working in that environment?
So I'll pick it up from what Sean said, and I understand where you're coming from. It's that tension between power and those who hold power to account has always been there. But as again we saw earlier in the panel before us, it is possible for that to be very civil and to be very constructive, right? The problem today is that as that is going on, as in the real world, you also have information warfare on social media. And that information warfare is directed against, in the Philippines in particular, I'll talk about that, against the journalists. We've cataloged, and we have the data to prove from July 2016 to August 2016, exponential lies that hit journalists in particular, anyone who questioned the drug war. Then you take that, where lies are used to pound the fracture lines of society and to incite hate against the people whose jobs are supposed to be to tell the truth. once you incite hate against them, you seed this kind of violence online. There's fear from real people who are afraid to jump in this case on the drug war, and then the lies compound. Then you add a president on top who then repeats the lies that are on social media, and you have an entire ecosystem that loses what fact is. It's not the fault of power alone. It's not the fault of the information warfare. I'll also hold social media to account for that, because they allow fact and fiction to exist simultaneously and allow fiction to spread faster, allow the lies to spread faster.
Okay, very specifically, just to interrupt you for a second, David. Just hold that thought, David, please. Very specifically, Sean mentioned the Pew organization. Now, they say that in the United States, only 20% of people get their news on a regular, daily, and singular basis from social media. So that means that 80% of consumers of news are still going to traditional, trustworthy media organizations. It may just be the NBC nightly news, but they are trustworthy media organizations. When your president assumed the top job, it was something like 30% occupancy rates on Facebook. It's now 97%. That is their only source of news for people who are internet enabled in your country. That's an astonishing change. I dare say Mr. Zuckerberg's very, very happy, as are his advertisers. But what is it about your country that went from 25, 30% to 97%?
It's just the push of mobile, it's connectivity going forward, it's the fact that we have free basics. Facebook is free on your cell phone, and when you get a cell phone, you automatically get Facebook, right? It's the same in many developing emerging economies. Myanmar is another one, Sri Lanka, the global south. So we have Indonesia also is free basics. So that is the truth. But, you know, please don't, in the United States, the amount of Americans, number of Americans, percentage is over 69% who get their news from Facebook. In the Philippines, you quoted 97%, right? I think the biggest problem we have now is that Facebook unites 2.3 billion people around the world. You no longer have boundaries of nation states. A lie seeded in one country reaches all of us. And one great example of that is the demonization of George Soros. I mean, the phrase anti-Semitism doesn't really exist in the Philippines, and yet George Soros has been used to attack Rappler. Has nothing to do with Rappler. Who cares about the facts, right? But that's part of our problem today. So what the White House does, what Sean says, alternate reality also impacts us in the Philippines. And I think that's the whole ecosystem we need to look at. It's power, it's journalism, it's real people, it is social media.
Okay, David, on that particular point of an ecosystem, before Donald Trump was any place near the White House, your former US President, Barack Obama, wanted to curate the internet because he saw this as a coming problem, because he saw the potential for the line of connection between fake news and journalists being attacked. Nobody was interested, and the idea of curating it went no place. Why not?
Well, I think the idea of curation, you immediately have to ask who curates, and that power, I think, giving any institution or any person that power is quite frightening. And so we haven't really come to grips with that. But there is a real issue there, not only the issue that Maria just described about lies issued in one place being propagated all over. But the other thing about social media platforms is the great democratization of publishing that they've created, that for a long time we thought was inarguably and unequivocally a wonderful thing, actually turns out not to be. If everyone can be a reporter, if everyone can be his or her own publisher, then there is really nothing that separates the professional from the amateur, and no reason to protect Maria any more than you should protect the person sitting in row 68. I think when we go from describing what we have now to thinking about what can be done in the future, and this I think picks up on Sean's point, I think journalists have to go back and really reevaluate professionalism and transparency. I think The only thing that makes a professional is if there are clearly agreed rules and standards within the profession, and the profession holds itself to account. If you just look at doctors and lawyers, doctors have organizations that strike other doctors off if they do something that's wrong. Lawyers get disbarred by their bar association if they do something wrong. But journalists, we do make corrections, yes, but as a profession, we never actually say,
Okay,
this
David, I'm
institution
going to
consistently get
interrupt
things
you,
wrong.
for which I apologise, because here on this Inside Story special, it's time for us to take a short break for a quick summary of the world news.